Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this next video from the series called IdentiSphere Explorer. In this video, we are going to talk about Auth0 deployment automation. So let's start. As always, let's start with a little bit of theory first. So there is a question, why deployment automation? And the simple and short answer is to configure things faster in Auth0. However, let's expand this statement here. So deployment automation can be really helpful to achieve consistent approach for deployments to different Auth0 tenants on different environments like dev, stage, production. And also, with deployment automation, we can eliminate potential manual errors. And before moving forward, I just want to mention a very important thing here. It's very important, it's crucial to keep the right balance. I'm not saying that utilizing Auth0 dashboard to configure some things is wrong. The thing is that there are some things that are great candidates for automation, and those can be handled through deployment tools like Azure DevOps, Bitbucket pipelines, stuff like this. And on the other side, you will be able to quickly achieve the result using Auth0 dashboard directly. So that's why it's very important to keep the right balance and to decide what actually is worth to be automated through deployment. And this is why I created this video. So let's move on. So to automate deployments to Auth0, to automate the configuration deployment, there is a dedicated tool called Auth0 Deploy CLI. So Auth0 Deploy CLI is a command line tool that lets you automate the deployment and management of Auth0 tenant configurations. So now let's look at supported resource types when it comes to Auth0 Deploy CLI. So we can utilize this tool to automate deployment and configuration for things like Auth0 actions, branding, clients, connections, hooks, secrets, and also tenant settings. So a lot of different things. And now the thing is that it's up to us to decide which of those we want to really automate. And it strictly depends on the process that we have in our organization. Let me put a simple example here. Obviously, when it comes to Auth0 actions, we write them in JavaScript, and obviously there is some code to be written. So in this case, it makes perfect sense to store the source code in a Git repository, and before deploying the Auth0 actions code to Auth0 tenant, to do some code review, to create a pull request, and then deploy this code to dev tenant, then to stage tenant, and after all the tests, to deploy this source code of actions to production tenant. However, on the other side, when it comes to client registration, like application registration, there can be a question mark. Is it worth to also automate deployment of such approach, like to actually register client applications in Auth0, or to have a dedicated person in our organization which will be responsible for opening Auth0 dashboard and registering specific client there. So it's very important to keep the right balance, because sometimes we can spend a lot of time automating different things, and in the end we realize that it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so let's see this usage scenario with Auth0 Deploy CLI. So here is the Git repository. It doesn't matter where we host this Git repository. It can be Azure DevOps, it can be Bitbucket, it can be GitLab, whatever it is, the source code of our Auth0 tenant or Auth0 actions or whatever it is stored in a Git repo. And now, obviously, in the automation tool, we have some kind of deployment pipeline where we integrate Auth0 Deploy CLI. And through Auth0 Deploy CLI, we can push those changes to specific Auth0 tenant. When it comes to Auth0 Deploy CLI, there are two specific commands that can be used: export command and import command. Let's discuss them now. So when it comes to export command, it enables us to export our Auth0 tenant configuration. And actually, to use Auth0 Deploy CLI, first we have to register application in Auth0 tenant, obtain client ID and client secret, and also grant specific permissions to use Auth0 Management API. Because obviously underneath Auth0 Deploy CLI is utilizing Auth0 Management API. So that's why we need client ID, client secret, and Auth0 domain, and then we can use Auth0 Deploy export command. We have to provide the format of the file for the export. So in this case, it will be YAML file and output folder. So where this YAML file with the whole tenant configuration will be created. So once we execute this command, the whole configuration for our tenant will be actually exported into YAML file. On the other side, we have import command. And again, to execute this command, we need Auth0 client ID, client secret, and domain from the application that we registered in Auth0 dashboard. And in this case, we use Auth0 deploy import command, where we can optionally specify the configuration file. So this will be the JSON file, but also we can use environment variables and then the input file. So again, this YAML file with the tenant configuration that should be applied. Okay, perfect. So now it's time for practical overview. I mentioned before that to use Auth0 Deploy CLI, we need to register application in Auth0 dashboard. So here it is, my Auth0 Deploy CLI machine-to-machine application registered in Auth0 tenant. And if I scroll down, we can see that here is the domain of my Auth0 tenant, the client ID, and also the client secret. So those values are required to successfully connect and import or export configuration from and to Auth0 tenant. Under API section, there is also, as you can see, information that my application is authorized to obtain access to Auth0 Management API. It's very important because, as I mentioned, Auth0 Deploy CLI utilizes Auth0 Management API underneath to actually update or delete or add different things in our Auth0 tenant. So when I expand this section, you can see that under permissions, I can select different kinds of permissions and that will be granted for this specific application. And as I mentioned, it's very important to keep the right balance. So please think about which things you really want to automate. Like, for instance, actions. It makes perfect sense to automate them because there is JavaScript source code. As I mentioned before, you can store this source code in a Git repository. You can have pull requests, code review process implemented. So in the end, you can actually review what will be deployed to your Auth0 tenant when it comes to actions. And as you can see, I select those three permissions: read, update, and create on actions. I don't want to delete them through the deployment pipeline, but obviously it depends on your specific needs. So you can enable this permission. And also, if I type triggers, you can see that I have update and delete, update and read for triggers, because I want to update those triggers with actions. So when it comes to triggers, this can be, like on login, on post registration, and stuff like this in Auth0. So in this case, I want to, first of all, deploy my Auth0 actions to Auth0 tenant, and then I want to attach specific action to a specific trigger. So when I expand actions, you can see that here I have library with my actions. So here the action will be deployed. And also under triggers, we have those different kinds of triggers like post login, post user registration, and stuff like this. So you can attach specific action to a specific trigger. Okay, perfect. So right now, let's see how it looks like from the source code perspective and actually deployment automation perspective. Here is Visual Studio Code and my IdentiSphere project source code opened. Before I will move forward, I just want to mention that for automation, I utilize Azure DevOps. So in this case, I store my source code in a Git repository in Azure DevOps, and I utilize Azure DevOps pipelines to deploy things to Auth0 utilizing Auth0 Deploy CLI. Okay, so on the left side, as we can see under Auth0 automation folder, I have two additional folders, environments and tenant config. Let's start with environments. The thing is that, as you remember, I mentioned that we can store the configuration parameters for Auth0 tenant in JSON file, or we can utilize environment variables, or we can use both JSON file and environment variables. And now the thing is that for local development, if you want to test something with Auth0 Deploy CLI, it's good to have this JSON file where you can store the parameter values and then reference them when utilizing Auth0 Deploy CLI import command. However, when you use other tools for automation like Azure DevOps or Bitbucket pipelines, probably you want to use variables, groups there in this tool, and you want to securely store parameters there and also reference them from the Auth0 Deploy CLI as environment variables. So that's why for local development and testing, prefer to use JSON file, obviously. But when you configure things in the real world for production, I strongly recommend storing parameters as variables in dedicated variable groups in those automation tools like Azure DevOps pipelines or Bitbucket pipelines or any other automation tool you utilize. Under tenant config folder, there is tenant YAML file, and this file actually contains my Auth0 tenant configuration. And now important thing is, as you can see here, I have branding, I have actions section, okay? And also below I have triggers section. An important thing is that depending on the permissions you granted to your application you registered in Auth0 tenant to utilize Auth0 management API, you will get specific tenant YAML file structure. Okay, that's very important. So if you want to get all the information about your tenant and keep it in the YAML file, then select all the permissions under Auth0 Management API for your Auth0 Deploy CLI application you registered in Auth0 tenant. However, in this specific scenario, I want to automate actually three things. I want to automate general branding for my tenant, and I want to also automate deployment for actions and triggers. So that's why I have this branding here. And here I want to set the page background, the primary color, and also the logo. So here I want to replace the logo URL with the specific URL of my company logo. And also under actions, as you can see here, for specific action for this example called add custom claims on login, I want to pass the values for different parameters like audience, Auth0 domain, client ID, client secret, custom claims namespace, target client ID, cloud extensions API URL. So all the things here will be passed during the deployment. And again, those things here, as you can see, those can be stored either in this JSON configuration file or as variables to be injected as environment variables in this specific scenario. So it's your choice, and as I mentioned, you can use both. And now the thing is that once this add custom claims on login action is deployed, I want to also attach it to post login trigger. Okay, so as we can see here, I have this action name and display name, and here I want to connect my action with the post login trigger. And now you can ask, okay, Daniel, so where is the source code of this specific action? So as we can see, there is specific path for the JS file. So if I expand actions folder and I expand add custom claims on login, here, as you can see, I have the source code of my Auth0 action. So again, as I mentioned before, it makes perfect sense to store those action codes in the Git repository because of the fact that, first of all, we can write action code once, we can add parameters there, and then we can deploy this action to different kinds of environments like dev, stage, or production. And also, additionally, from the source code management perspective, we can add code reviews and we can also implement pull requests. So in this case, before even deploying anything to Auth0, we can do the code review of such action code to check whether it has proper structure, parameters, and stuff like this. Perfect. So right now, once we have our code exported using Auth0 Deploy CLI export command, and once we have the tenant YAML file created, we can add those parameters here, which will be injected from config JSON file or from environment variables. And in the end, we can define the deployment pipeline. So this is a sample deployment pipeline for Azure DevOps. And as we can see here, in this pipeline, obviously, I want to trigger this pipeline when any change is pushed to dev or main branch and under this specific path, so Auth0 automation. And as we can see here, I'm referencing variable groups depending on the branch. So if this is a develop branch, I want to use TMF IdentiSphere dev variable group. If this is the main branch, I want to use TMF IdentiSphere production variable group. And obviously, again, how you will structure those deployments strongly depends on your requirements and your process within your organization. However, important thing is that under stages here, as we can see, what I have deployment to dev environment, okay? So if changes were pushed to develop branch, I want to trigger deployment to Auth0 for dev environment. So what will happen under tasks? So first of all, I need to install Node.js if it's not already there. And then I need to install Auth0 Deploy CLI. Okay? And once I have those tools installed, I can use Auth0 Deploy import command, so the command I mentioned before. And here I have to provide the input file, so the YAML file, the tenant YAML file here. And also, as you can see, I'm passing here environment variables. Okay, so all those values here, like Auth0 client ID, client secret, domain, all other things here will be injected during the deployment, and those values will be taken from one of those variable groups in Azure DevOps. In this case, for dev environment, it will be taken from the TMF IdentiSphere dev variable group. So in this case, as you can see, I can eliminate using any secrets and storing any secrets in my source code of my tenant or actions. Everything will be stored in the dedicated deployment tool, like Azure DevOps in this case. And during deployment, those environment variables will be injected and then parameters will be replaced. So that's why in the tenant YAML file, for instance, the Auth0 tenant main logo URL will be replaced with the specific value from the variable group. So here, as you can see. Okay, perfect. So now it's time to see this deployment in action. Here is Azure DevOps, and under pipelines, we can see that I have my IdentiSphere Auth0 CI/CD pipeline. When I click it, I can see all the runs for this pipeline. An important thing is that I can either trigger this pipeline manually, or it will be triggered every time there is any change pushed to a develop branch. So if I click run the pipeline here, as you can see, I will run it for develop branch and I will click run. It will be executed now. So as we can see here under jobs, there is one job, deploy Auth0 config. And if I click this job in a couple of seconds, I should be able to see all the steps we explained from the deployment pipeline structure. So first of all, the source code is checked out from the Git repository, Node.js is installed, then we install Auth0 Deploy CLI here, and in the end, we want to deploy to dev environment, so to dev Auth0 tenant. So all the changes are being deployed right now. If I click this specific step, we will be able to see actually the logs here. And once this specific pipeline execution is completed, we will have our configuration deployed to Auth0 tenant. Perfect. So we can see that all the steps were actually executed successfully here. And we can see that right now the configuration was updated in my Auth0 dev tenant. Important thing is that under library, I have this TMF IdentiSphere dev variable group I mentioned before. And this is actually the place, as you can see, where I define all the parameters which will be actually injected as variable groups during the pipeline execution. So those parameters will be passed to Auth0 Deploy import command to make sure that they will be actually injected into tenant configuration. So here, as you can see, for instance, there is this environment variable called Auth0 included only. And here I can specify which actually things from the Auth0 configuration I want to include in this deployment. So in this case, I want to use actions, triggers, branding, and tenant settings. And obviously, I can modify it here. So right now, if I remove this one here, only branding will be applied and triggers and actions, so I can click Save button. And obviously, you can modify this accordingly to your needs. So I strongly encourage visiting the Auth0 Deploy CLI website, which is referenced in this video description. But the important thing is that also I have the tenant mail logo URL here, as you can see, reference, and all the things that will be used for a Auth0 action I explained before. So during the execution, the parameters from this variable group will be taken as environment variables. They will be injected. So in the end, when we deploy things to Auth0 tenant, we can use the right configuration. So as you can see, it can be really beneficial because instead of using those JSON configuration files, we can create dedicated variable group for each environment here and store those parameters. And then we can be sure that even if we have the same tenant YAML file, different parameters, specific parameters for specific environment will be used during the deployment. The last important thing I want to mention is the fact that I utilize Auth0 Deploy CLI in IdentiSphere platform, which I architected and developed. If you would like to learn more about this platform, I encourage you to visit my website, techmindfactory.com, and open Advisory tab. That's it. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next videos.